Welcome to HoCoPoLitSo's The Writing Life. I'm Cóilín Parsons, and my guest today is Caoilinn Hughes. Caoilinn is an Irish poet, a short story writer, and a novelist. She grew up in the west of Ireland, and she studied in Belfast, at that hotbed of poetry, and in New Zealand. She now lives in London. Her debut novel, Orchid and the Wasp, won the 2019 Collier-Bristow Prize and was shortlisted for many, many more prizes. Her second novel, The Wild Laughter, won the Royal Society of Literature's prestigious Encore Award. And her third novel, published just 2 years ago, The Alternatives, was a New York Times editor's pick. Her short stories have won the Moth Short Story Prize, which you'll know from NPR, and the O. Henry Award, and also an Unpussed Irish Book Awards Short Story of the Year Prize. In short, critics and juries alike have loved her work, and you will too. I love it because it's sparky, it's surprising. Her writing is rhythmic, brilliant, with deep and complex characters with whom we spend a generous amount of time. The novels are full of ideas, of philosophy, of politics, and of astonishing insights into the world around their characters. Caoilinn, you're very welcome to The Writing Life. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for the gorgeous introduction.
You're very welcome. I said you were a poet and a short story writer and a novelist, but those are almost in sort of succession. You were a poet first, you dropped poetry, I think, would that be right? And then moved to novel writing, and then I think after that, short story writing. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that trajectory?
Sure. Well, I started writing poetry because that's what I read as a child, which sounds absolutely obnoxious. But the truth is I'm a very slow reader, and I found novels to be intimidating. So I reached for the slimmest volumes on the shelves, which were poetry books and plays. So that's really what I read. I think I've because nobody else was reading them as well, I sort of felt that there was a power in that in that act of reading, and that it felt sort of an intimate experience. And I felt a sort of direct dialogue in a way with the author that I just don't think I was able to, look at prose and feel that sort of that electric charge or something. And so then when I started writing, it was natural, I suppose, to start with poetry. But I also then I didn't read novels until I was about 18. I got a box of banned books for my 17th birthday, and I read those from one end to the other, and then I was converted. But it really took a long time before I started reading novels, and so then it took another, say, decade, before I started writing prose. And then once I did, I realised that prose was where I felt I was using more of my tools.
What was the impetus to start writing? I've been reading novels for years, and I've never written one.
Well, I think I always wanted to be a writer. I was in a way that was the only thing that I wanted to do. So, from a very young age, I mean, I think the first long thing I wrote was a pastiche of Father Ted, which was put on in my primary school, and I was given like a quota of swear words to be used. I won't repeat them now in case I'll get in trouble, but it was just an identity that I had from quite a young age. So. And I never knew that I would write novels, but I moved to New Zealand from Belfast, which is, as you mentioned, it was at the time, a real hub of poetry. Now there's a lot more prose writers that are working that I am absolutely adoring at the moment. So, but at the time, everyone was reading poetry, and so it felt both sanctioned and something that you were inspired all the more to read because people wanted to talk about it. But then I moved to New Zealand, and first of all, I didn't have any literary circle, and the landscape shock and the culture shock was so huge that I just found it impossible. I sort of needed that something about the atmosphere, the indoors atmosphere as well, and whereas New Zealand for me was very much about venturing into the landscape, and it was an expansive mode, and so I found my way towards prose because of that.
So it's almost about the space of the novel, giving you space to be a bigger thinker, to write more, to write sort of larger characters and spaces?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily larger themes, but something that requires more time and duration and concentration on the one thing, you know.
Speaking of duration, maybe you'll read from us from your latest novel, The Alternatives. And I say duration because there's a lot of thinking about long time in this novel.
There is indeed. So it's a book about four sisters who all have PhDs and none have husbands.
That's how it works.
Bestseller, here I come. And so the sister that you're going to hear from now, she's a geologist, and she's been teaching about the collapse of deep time, where processes that should be taking place over millennia are happening over decades. So essentially, she's teaching about climate change, and she's dealing with a kind of frightened group of students. So you'll hear her now speaking to her undergraduate class in the University College Galway, and you don't need to know anything. The air is mild for October. Nothing shivers, nothing smokes. A gentle westerly whistles at the panes of the lab windows like an unwelcome uncle, determined to raise the hairs on some young neck. 20 necks bend to observe the experiment. A perspex prism, known as a squeeze box, the size of a narrow aquarium, is filled with thin layers of coloured sands, a bit like this guy here. And the ends of the box are movable so that its contents can be compressed to demonstrate the effects of tectonic convergence. Thrusts, faults, folds, belts. Excuse me. Alwyn presses a fist to her mouth to stifle a burp, and a few students snicker. Lo and behold, geologic processes for the puny human attention span. There's something very bodily about Alwyn flattery that the undergraduates find wildly amusing. Moments earlier, she'd used a shard of slate to scratch her inner elbow psoriasis, and a puff of dead skin particles danced visibly in the ventilation. She placed the shard back in its tray and, with her chalky fingers, lifted out a teeny tiny sanitised kidney stone for the undergraduate's scrutiny. Moving this kidney stone involved a person's hospitalisation. Just imagine the force it would take to move a mountain. We're not talking about violent, sudden processes like an earthquake shouldering up a mountain range. No, these forces are so incremental and immense, so imperceivable and unstoppable that there's no halting their progress. They're underway right now as we stand here on the shifting foundations of this institute. The students scan their pals for clues as to how to feel. They've learned to take what levity they can from these light and flaky moments, as Alwyn's lectures so far have been something of a shockwave. We're a wreck, she says. Ireland is one big crash site, where the ancient continents, Laurentia and Gondwana, collided like two humongous cruise liners, long before the nouveau riche were evolved to populate them. The wreckage cuts stupendously across this island, from Dingle in the west to Clogherhead in the east. The island was underwater back then, so that story didn't make itself known for millions of years. And here we stand, sifting through the evidence of that collision in our desk organisers, all of us above sea level, for another decade or two anyways. Several students begin to agitate in the pause that follows. It's hard to read the undergraduates, to know what's getting through, what with the scarves cobraed around their mouths and their minimal eye contact. They all seem hungover, stoned, or just returned from a silent monetary meditation retreat in Bali they spent their loans on. But they also seem deeply unnerved, and it's not paranoia. How information is delivered seems to be more consequential than the information itself, Alwyn thinks. She is losing her strength to hand it over gently. But a teacherly muscle memory prompts her now, having pushed, to pull. Have any of ye seen it? She makes eye contact with each student in turn, in case, as first years, they need drawing out. Shauna, an exchange student with the gall of a parking enforcement officer, asks, "Is it here in Galway? Because car rental in this country is a joke." "It's not in the immediate vicinity, Shauna, but I saw the Rock of Gibraltar." Eric offers out of nowhere, a very tall student with asteroidal confidence. Alwyn hears the clock on the wall tick forward a cluster of seconds all in one go, like heart palpitations, harmless but horrible. If you tell me you flew down to see the Rock of Gibraltar, Eric, when you haven't taken a bus to Dingle to ogle our own monumental bodies of rock. In the pause that follows, Eric takes a seat and runs his fingers through his gelled hair, leaving striations that seem almost infrastructural, as if water might collect in them. Alwyn is grateful when Fionnuala, not technically a mature student, but she has a lot of cop on, cuts in with something likely to be relevant. I went to Edinburgh during the summer. For the festival, Geraldine clenches with envy. Yeah, says Fionnuala, but we took a day trip to Sicker Point. She glances at Alwyn. You did not. Alwyn replaces a chunk of granite she'd been using as a stress ball back in the specimen tray, readying herself to shake Fionnuala's hand. Fionnuala smiles. It was a little tricky to get out onto the rock, but it was worth it. Alwyn looks around the group. Does anyone know what historic expedition Fionnuala was honouring, trekking out to Sicker Point on Scotland's weather-battered coast, when she could have stayed in Edinburgh town to watch shit-faced Shakespeare? Do you want to say, Fionnuala, what you saw there, and who saw it first? Fionnuala acts a touch more flustered than she is. So James Hutton, I guess back in the 1700s, found these rock formations, these really crazy layered rocks, kind of like pastry. Or maybe I just associate Scotland with pastry. Sedimentary rock, like the strata of coloured sand, Alwyn gestures, in our squeeze box experiment. Exactly, yeah. So there were horizontal layers like that and vertical sections too, side by side or kind of on top of one another at right angles. And the vertical rocks and the horizontal ones formed in totally different ways in different time periods. And Hutton basically looked at them and instantly understood plate tectonics, or a theory that led to it. Or was it just that he knew that the centre of the earth was molten rock and that was how new land was made, instead of, God making it? Because before that, he could see erosion happening and he couldn't understand how all land hadn't just washed away by the weather. How is there anything left? And the only explanation anyone knew for new land was God. But when Hutton saw those rocks, he knew they were evidence that the earth was billions of years old instead of thousands, because, those formations would have taken, a really, really long time. At Fionnuala's unsure expression, Alwyn nods with the restrained pride of a surgeon confirming that they got it all, that the patient has plenty of life ahead.
Very good. I love just that tiny detail that Fionnuala acts more flustered than she is. That tiny detail brings us into exactly what the classroom feels like, how strange the classroom is. Anyway, I know you're a teacher, so you have been a teacher, so you get it. Can I ask about part of it is that that novel, and in fact the part that you just read, is so packed with sort of ideas about the earth, and your task in that novel is how to turn that into narrative, how to make people. And that's a real. Critics have been thinking about this about climate fictions, how do we activate knowledge about the slow violence of environmental degradation. And you do it through dialogue.
Yeah. Well, the way that I was thinking about this, and the reason I found this novel, I was terrified to write the novel because, my partner's a climate scientist, and honestly, writers are incredibly horrible to date. Read The Seagull by Chekhov if you need proof of that. But climate scientists are worse. But someone has to love them, and so. But it's also not just, so people working in the field of climate change right now, I think the rest of the world is finally seeing them a little bit. Yeah. And that's just not a pocket of, a small pocket of university professors. That's all sorts of people, secondary school teachers, anyone who's having to contend with the questions about the future and questions about, cognitive dissonance and how you're supposed to make sense of and reconcile your sense of grief and discomfort and your own guilt and participation in growth capitalism. So I think it touches so many different jobs. So I don't mean to say that it's just about a small group of people, but I knew that with this novel, in a way, I'd be thinking about what it is to be alive right now, how to forge a path forward as the path is crumbling beneath your feet. And all of the sisters are doing this in different jobs. And that's the moment that we're in. And also, I wanted to honor the fact that there are a group of people who've been mandated to perform optimism. It's been a compulsory optimism. And I mean, my partner gets asked, I would say, on a weekly basis by total strangers, do you have hope? And that's a brutal thing to be asked, because it comes with the obligation of how do you respond to that. And then you're trying to calibrate, like, how long does this person have? What sort of situation are they in? How deep can we go? Does someone just want a quick answer and then they go invest in a bunker? So it's and that also is very damaging to the person who has to try and answer those questions. So I wanted to honor the group of people who have been having to answer that question. And to allow space for that optimism to wobble. Because I think it's really bleak if there isn't any room for that, even in our imagination. And I didn't know that the novel would be publishable, but I knew that I needed to write it.
Now, Olwen walks off, let's just say. She takes a particular tack. But there are 4 sisters, as you said, each of whom is grappling in a different way with some big question, big problem. Do you want to sketch us out exactly how? The genius of this novel is that it reads still like a novel of character, of feeling, of emotion, with a plot, all of these things, even while there are these huge ideas spinning around it. Tell us about the other 3 sisters, just very briefly.
Sure. So the baby sister is Nell, who's a philosophy professor adjuncting at 3 different colleges in Connecticut. She's been adjuncting for nearly 20 years. And then there is Maeve, who is just older than her, and she lives on a houseboat in London, and she's a chef. So she's the only one whose PhD is honorary, which she gets reminded to her all the time. And she is working, she's been sort of radicalized by Olwen, and she is so very interested in local food production, and also the line where that tips over into sort of neo-nationalism. That's a hairy area. And then there is Rona, who is a political scientist working in Trinity, and she's a professor in Trinity. She's a sort of talking head in Ireland, and so she's the most ostensibly successful of them all. But she's also living in a mansion in Dublin that she's having to pay for a seawall to be constructed to protect their insurance policies. So her work is around participatory democracy, so tools of direct democracy like citizens' assemblies, and they each are being they're in moments of flux in the viability of their own careers. But it was interesting to write about women at work expressing themselves through their professions. And I also love that you could have a book that's about women at work, but that's also a book about family, and that those two didn't need to be 2 separate novels,
And it's a book about climate, it's a book about weather, it's a book about food, all of these things that impact on our everyday lives, but all packed into this book. If I were to sketch out your 3 novels so far and ask you to make sense of all 3 of them, would that be a terrible question? No.
I haven't been to enough therapy.
Orchid and the Wasp set exactly at the time of, just after the crash of, give me a year,
it's
like
2011. It's still around 2011.
Yeah, around the time of the Wall Street protests, the Occupy Wall Street. And then the middle novel really set in Ireland, exactly in the aftermath of essentially the same crash, but the housing crisis. And then this last one set, we can pinpoint it almost to as the Brexit negotiations are taking place.
Yeah, it's a little later. So it's 2020. Well,
I pinpointed it wrong.
Most of it is 2023.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of the opening chapters follow each of the sisters individually, and those ones are a little earlier.
So putting those three together, now you're writing them more or less around that time, essentially, but I mean, these are three novels that spotlight very particular moments of when there's a structure of feeling, to speak as a literary critic, a structure of feeling of some kind of crisis or collapse. Is that, am I reading too much into your three novels together?
I can see how, yeah, I mean, I suppose I tend to not think about that type of thing too much, because I'm terrified of, I love not knowing what I'm writing. Yeah. And I don't design novels from the outset. I write completely into the dark without any sort of structure or outline or plan. And actually I don't like to know anything, because then it feels like there's no room for any wisdom to grow of its own, and for any truth that the novel itself begets, in a way, like, which is the only reason I write, is to become sort of more sophisticated in my thinking, a sort of bigger person, in like lowering my judgment, opening my mind, like, you know. So if I know where something is going, I feel like I'm just creating a bridge, and that's a structure that we know, and it's not, I mean, that's what works for me. So it's not to kind of belittle anyone who works the other way, but I need that sort of obscurity. And so maybe thinking about the kind of meta narrative of my work, I've not done too much thinking about. Someone did, an academic did once mention that in The Wild Laughter, as in Orchid, that there's a sense, especially in The Wild Laughter, that the character, she said that sometimes the sentences are sort of front to back, and that it's like there's a wrong-footedness that resembles the way that the character feels that he's been wronged, and I thought that was so great. Like, it was a very ugly thing to be told, in the sense of like, oh, maybe you think that you've been wronged in some way, but I loved it because it felt just right, and I like that the books will. I certainly try not to ever flatter myself, or I like writing characters that are complicated.
Yeah, there's a real springiness to the language of The Wild Laughter. Can I ask you just very quickly? You mentioned something before I ask you to read again. Just at the close, you mentioned that you write essentially in one go, or you don't go back. Tell us about this process. I'm amazed at this, and especially because the complexity, the deepness of the novels. How does that work?
So I tend to write, now the novel that I'm working on at the moment, this is, each novel is different, but so this is the first time where I'm actually having to go back. I'm really going back and only keeping the beginning and going again, but I'm going in a completely different direction with the same characters. So I think the heart of it is going to be the same, but it needs a redraft, and there's a whole complicated story behind that. But normally my process, and I suppose it is very much the case that it's normally so, because apart from three novels, I've written many short stories, and so I think you learn about yourself through the short story, especially. I write. I spend a long time sort of circling around and rejecting something, and finally kind of admitting that it wants to be paid attention to. And it's often just a character with a certain energy or in a certain situation, and then I have to eventually sit with them, and so I write from the beginning sentence to the end, and often most of it is intact. So I don't really, it's so far in my work, I've never had to drop in, whole new chapters, or remove chapters, or add subplots, or change radical things about characters. Nothing. It's really just editing, and I think that's because I write so slowly. I'm constantly kind of using a tuning fork for what feels like dishonest. And if something feels like I manipulated it because, I don't know, it was funny, or a character said something that was amusing or convenient for the scene, so I try to just tune that to feel for what's honest. And if you do that, I think all you need to do is just go slowly.
Well, speaking of a tune, and for something being honest, I think you're going to read from The Wild Laughter for us here, sure, for a couple of minutes. Deeply attuned to language, and deeply attuned to this question of crash. I think you said Ireland is a crash site when you were talking about tectonics, but this is a crash site as well here, about this sort of the world post a particular financial crash.
Okay, so you're going to hear, this is the only thing I've ever written in first person. As you're going to hear from Doherty Black, that he's called Heart. The night the chief died, I lost my father, and the country lost a battle it wouldn't confess to be fighting. For the no-collared labouring class, for the decent, dependable patriarch, for right of entry from the field into the garden. Jurors were appointed to gauge the casualty. They didn't wear black. Don't they know black is flattering? The truth isn't. They kept safe and silent. I didn't. When is the confession an absolution, and when is it a sentencing? I'd like to find out. I suppose there's only one outcome for souls like us, heavy-going souls the like of mine and the long-lost chiefs, and not a good one. But I'll lay it on the line, if only to remind the people of who they are, a far cry from neutral judicial equipment. Determining the depth of rot that's blackening the surface can't always be left to deities or legislators. Sometimes what's needed is to tie a string around the tooth and shut the door lively. He was a bright young thing, my brother, Cormac. His mind was a luxury. The face was rationed, it must be said, but there's not a body with everything. Part T-Rex, part pelican. Picture that menace of features, close-eyed, limb-chinned, thin skin thick as the red carpet he imagined laid down beneath his wellies, tall as the door he expected to be let in. When he was 12, he looked 20. The mind was ahead too, as I said. The odd girl went in for such a harrow of a fella. The odd girl, and not the even, on account of his brains and his chesty conduct. Not that he was liberal with his cleverness, but there was the atmosphere of it, knowing at any moment that something you'd say would be turned inside out like a child's eyelid to traumatize you, to show you the violence behind it that you never meant, or maybe you did.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you read. I know that you read one of your books for audiobooks, and I can see why.
Thank you.
How you can bring those characters to life.
Thank you so
even
much.
The meanness.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Thanks very much. Caoilinn Hughes, it's been a pleasure to have you. I'd love to spend more time with you with lots more questions. And thank you for joining us on this episode of HoCoPoLitSo's The Writing Life. Thank you.